Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, sponsored by EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, and also sponsored by Natural Awakenings magazine. Live your healthiest life on a healthier planet. Now here's your host, Bernice Butler.
Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We're here now in our second season, and we're more excited than ever to continue to help you explore and understand the unbreakable relationship between your health and the health of the planet. We look at the hottest topics related to our environment and its sustainability and how they affect your health and wellness. Here, issues like climate change, plastic pollution, extreme weather events, and others will meet up with everyday impacts like allergies and asthma, digestive issues and gut health, cancers, lung and heart issues, and more. So listen in today as we interview experts for today's show on plastics pollution at the intersection with human cancers. Now, since its mass production began in the 1940s, plastic's wide range of unique properties has propelled it to an absolute essential status in our society today. In fact, next year, more than 300 million tons of plastic will be produced worldwide. From cell phones and computers to bicycle helmets and hospital IV bags, plastics has molded society in many ways that make life both easier and safer. But the synthetic material also has left harmful imprints on the environment as well as human health, according to a recent compilation of articles authored by leading scientists from around the world. As well, one of the ubiquitous and long-lasting recent changes to the surface of our planet is the accumulation and fragmentation of plastics. Plastics are very, very long-lived products that could potentially have service over many, many decades. And yet, our main use of these lightweight, inexpensive materials are single-use items that will go into garbage dump within a year, while they will persist and last for centuries. Plastics are, again, very long-lived products that could potentially have service over decades, and yet our main use just goes on and on. Evidence is mounting that the chemical building blocks that make plastics so versatile are the same components that can harm people and the environment. Chemicals added to plastics are absorbed by human bodies, and some of these compounds have been found to alter hormones or have other potential human health impacts, and its production and disposal contribute to a wide array of environmental problems as well. This is a lot. And here today to help us explore and understand this some more are Dr. Justin Colacino and Nsedu Obat Witherspoon. Justin Colacino is an assistant professor of environmental health sciences in the School of Health at the University of Michigan. His research focuses on the understanding of environmental and dietary factors in carcinogenesis and cancer prevention. Specifically, the goal of Justin's research is to characterize the environmental susceptibility of normal human stem cell populations, explaining the cause of sporadic cancers. And of particular interest to him are understanding the changes that occur at the non-genetic and the cellular level. Justin is an active member of the Society of Toxicology and the American Association for Cancer Research and serves on the editorial review board of Environmental Epigenetics and the editorial board of Cancer Research. Welcome, Justin, and did I get all of that right?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Bernice. Yes, that is correct.
We're excited you could be with us. Our other guest is Nse Witherspoon. And Nse is the executive director for the Children's Environmental Health Network in Washington, D.C., where her responsibilities include successfully organizing, leading, and managing policy, education and training, and science-related programs. For the past 18 years, Nse has served as a key spokesperson for children's vulnerabilities and the need for their protection. She's a leader in the field of children's environmental health, serving as a member of the National Institute of Health of Councils on the science of children's environmental health, as well as on the advisory board for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the External Science Board for the environmental influences on child health outcomes. INSEE is also co-leader for advancing the Science Health Initiative of the National Collaborative on a Cancer-Free Economy. And she's a board member of the Pesticide Action Network of North America, of the Environmental Integrity Project. Welcome, INSEE. Did I get all of that right?
Thank you. I guess we would all exhaust ourselves reading the bios, but yes, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here with both of you.
Thank you. And I wanted our listeners to really know that what a caliber of experts that we have with us today, and what an honor and how exciting it is to have both of you here to help us really unpack this and dive deep into what is a very common thing that's just all around us. So I want to begin by you all helping us understand what and which plastics cause cancers and why or how they do that cancer causing. And we'll go ahead and start with you, Justin. And as you tell us that, tell us what are some of the most dangerous chemicals and toxins in plastic.
Sure. Yeah. So there's a lot of different types of plastic that we might encounter in our daily lives. And you can see these as you look around your home or your office or your car. So there's like polyvinyl chloride plastics, PVC plastics, there's polycarbonate plastics and polypropylene plastics. And all these are made up with different chemicals, right? And what we're concerned about is the individual building blocks of these plastics might be causing harm. And so we do know that some of these chemicals can cause cancer. Way back in the 1970s, there were some really important epidemiology studies that were conducted in manufacturers of those PVC plastics, for instance, where physicians that were working at these plants where these PVC plastics were being manufactured noticed that their workers came in with these like really rare types of liver cancer, these hepatic hemangiosarcomas they're called. These are cancers that almost never happen in the U.S. And in this worker population, 4 or 5 of these workers end up reporting with these cancers. The doctors start to get concerned, and then we look deeper and we start to see that these plastics, these vinyl chloride plastics, are the things that are causing these liver cancers. So we know that there are compounds in plastic that can cause cancer, but we're still really trying to figure this out. There's so many types of plastic. There's so many compounds that go into these plastics. They all have different effects in our bodies. That we're really still trying to figure out the mechanisms by which these chemicals might cause cancer.
But the study that you mentioned where the plastic manufacturing plant noticed these high incidents, was that our first inkling that there's something going on here?
Yeah, as far as I know, this was our first real inkling that something about plastics and the plastic manufacturing process could be causing cancer in people, especially those that are really highly exposed in the occupational setting.
Exactly. One thing with regards to this, and then I want to go back to some of the plastics that you had mentioned earlier. In regards to plastic manufacturing plants, those still exist today. Are they still seeing these incidences? Are they not? Or what's been done to lower them? What's the status of that right now?
Sure, yeah. So the government groups like OSHA and NIOSH, they were alarmed by these like increasing rates of cancer in these vinyl chloride manufacturers. So they went, the government goes and they reset permissible limits for people that are working in these manufacturing plants. And so these levels of these cancers have decreased, but now people are doing more in-depth occupational health studies, and they're starting to see that people that work at these plants might be at increased risk of other types of cancer, like breast cancer, which is what my lab studies.
And now I want to briefly go back. When you started talking earlier, you mentioned a lot of plastics, initials, and what have you. I want you, if you can, list those again, but what I need you to do is then tell us how we come in contact with those, how we know what those are.
Sure. So there's the PVC type plastics. So these are, you can think about like your shower curtain is like one of these types, like maybe vinyl flooring in your kitchen. These are these PVC type plastics. So this like vinyl chloride is the one that this like chemical that was linked to this type of liver cancer. There's other potentially hazardous chemicals in these PVC plastics that my lab and others have been studying for a long time called phthalates. And these phthalates are added to these PVC plastics, and that's what makes these plastics flexible. Another one that people are potentially concerned about are polycarbonate plastics. And so you can think about like the classic Nalgene water bottle is made of these polycarbonate plastics, these like clear, hard plastics.
That's the one that they give to you at all the expos and everything with the
exactly
company imprints on them.
Branded.
Okay.
Yeah, and so there's polypropylene plastics. And so these are other sort of like harder plastics that tend to be not as reactive as the polyvinyl chloride-based plastics or the polycarbonate. Yeah, so these single-use plastic containers, these are sometimes made with those phthalate-based plastics. Yeah.
Okay. And then the multi-use, like our Tupperware or some of those others, what are those?
Yeah, so some of those can be polypropylene-based. And then some of these, you can even get, like glass-based ones would be even better, of course, right?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Justin. We're going to go to break, and after break, we're going to talk to Inse about the health impacts of some of those and what she's seeing in her experience. We'll be right back on the other side of the break. Thank you. We want to give a shout-out to our sponsors now. That is EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, promoting environmental awareness through expo, conferences, film festival, interactive experiences, and now EarthX streaming TV. Our other sponsor is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, Central Market, sunflower shops, and many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, and more. And we're told with the best Christmas trees in Texas. Check them out at nhg.com. Our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lynndentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. We are back with our great load of expertise today on our show on plastic pollution, the effects and impacts for humans and cancer. And again, we are back with Justin Colacino with the University of Michigan and Inse with the Children's Environmental Health Network. We're very glad to have them. And so, Inse, we want to start this segment with you. Justin was just telling us about the plastic intersection with cancers. And he told us a number of the types of chemicals and things that we come in contact with and how we typically come in contact with them. So I want to focus back in, though, on those dangerous chemicals and toxins in plastics. It looks like various plastics contain various chemicals. Can you talk to us about how our bodies most commonly exposed to these? And it seems BPA is probably the big bad guy. How are our bodies most commonly exposed to these? Give us everyday examples as well as everyday health impact examples.
Sure. And of course, BPA or bisphenol A may be a common one that maybe we've seen labeled on certain plastics, so it might be very common to listeners. But sadly, there are over 1,000 known chemicals in various forms of plastics that we come in contact with in different iterations of our lifestyle. And 80% of them are unknown or have not been tested, if you will, for their health and safety when it comes to our exposures, and certainly not tested for the vulnerabilities of young children, for example, which are extremely concerning. And yet these chemicals are knowingly allowed to be produced in a wide range of ways, and we are, constantly daily exposed, as we said in the last segment. You have the first route of exposure in the production itself, the manufacturing of these chemicals. So if you're in a fence-line communities that live right there in an industrial area and or work in these facilities, and sometimes it's both, that's a frontline exposure. And then, of course, how those plastics then, when they're coming into commerce, are then being used and how we're using them. Sometimes heating them, reheating them, and using them, and the manipulation of those chemicals cause yet another range. And then you have the legacy part of it, right? So we know that there are a variety of plastic bags. I think plastic bags are the biggest culprit in our oceans. There's all kinds of junk in our oceans, but they're causing problems to the fish life and all of that, as well as the health of the sea, for example. But going into some of these specifics, polyvinyl chloride, PVC, is typically found in what, if you pull a water bottle or a plastic bottle on the bottom, you'll see like the recycle code, if you will, or the code that tells you the type of plastic. So a number 3 plastic is where you tend to find a lot of them, and they are definitely linked to cancer, known carcinogens. And they're known to be, if you will, some of the most harmful or toxic of them. That's the one, again, that contains bisphenol A, BPA, lead, which is a known neurotoxic route of exposure, phthalates, mercury, which also causes brain changes, dioxins, cadmium. And what happens with that exposure is there's an attack on the central nervous system. So there are signs and symptoms like dizziness, inebriation, fatigue, which aren't, I guess, so awful. They're not comfortable, but also all the way down to coma and death, depending on severity of exposure. And when you think about where you see some of these children, for example, their school supplies, like lunch boxes, their backpacks, their binders, they can typically be made out of this PVC plastic. And that's extremely dangerous, especially considering the daily use of those type of things. And then again, when you break down BPA a little bit more, bisphenol A, or some of the regrettable substitutions for BPA, we know that it's a hormone disruptor. So it's linked to a host of problems where you're getting in the way of the normal development of your hormone system, which causes all kinds of things, coronary artery heart disease, heart attack, hypertension, among a slew of long-term illnesses and concerns just due to that level of exposure. Phthalates, we know, are linked to hormone disruption as well, and reproductive harm in baby boys in particular. There is science to show. And then PFAS, I would like to bring them up. Yeah. The fluoroalkyl substances, right, which are known as the forever chemicals. They're found in just about everything, sadly. Food packaging, like these single-use we were talking about earlier, microwave popcorn bags, the liner in a pizza box that prevents it from, if you put it on your lap, getting the grease then going through onto your clothes. So in theory, there's a function for all of these. But again, what we would say in public health is that that functionality, for us to have that function, the health and well-being and safety of all of us has not yet taken the precedence and the priority before use. So again, when it comes to PFAS, stain-resistant carpets, rugs, furniture, nonstick cookware, that benefit of having that egg that just kind of slides off and maybe makes it a little easier for cleaning comes with some long-term implications, especially with continued use. Outdoor gear, anything that's considered durable water repellent, usually has a coating of these substances. And then there's been a lot of attention in the aerospace, medical, and even the military world, because there's been a lot of exposures to military complexes and, unfortunately, contamination of water supplies.
Let me ask you this and say, before we move on to some of the diseases, we are assaulted, inundated all around with these various types of plastics. But I want to talk about or connect the dots for our listeners in terms of how and at what point they begin to really affect our health. Is it just touching them? Is it breathing them? Are they in the air, or is it heat? I remember it's probably been about 5 or 6 years ago when we used to begin to be warned about drinking water from the water bottles once they have been opened or left out in the heat, which led some of us to realize it's the heat that's doing it. But it took me a while there because I didn't connect the dots and they weren't clearly connected for me. So what is it that makes them volatile or activates them in terms of possible health impact, or is it just touching them? Inse, if you would start on that, and then we want Justin to weigh in on that as well.
Sure, it's a great question. So there's magnitudes of order here. They by themselves are enough of a toxic situation. And usually it's airborne in many cases. Like if there's industry, there's a production of chemicals, right? So there's these industries where people are working, and unbeknownst to them, at times very much exposed occupational hazard situation. And then the emissions from these industries are then polluting the air. The people in the local vicinity, but certainly wind carries air and air pollutants, so it doesn't just stay in a community. But this is where a lot of justice issues comes in, and I know we're going to talk about that later. But you have communities that are right there. We call them fence line, what we would call essential workers also in many cases during this COVID pandemic. They're one and the same in many cases. And then you have these magnitudes of order. So by themselves, they're toxic. what we've known, sadly, because we are all the guinea pigs, and the health outcomes that are displaying themselves in us, when you're following back and you're looking at the type of research that we're talking about, you then start to see these similarities of people that were in the same places or had the same exposures or worked in the same places, lived in the same neighborhoods, drank the same water, that type of thing. But then you have mixtures. Most of us are not exposed just in a singular form to these types of chemicals, carcinogens and others. You have these mixture of chemicals that were never, ever meant to enter the human body. And certainly in my realm of the world, never meant to be, children are being pre-polluted, sadly, as they're being born now. So reproductive health is extremely important, not just mom, as the womb is the first environment for a child, but also dad. We now know that there's a lot of exposures in early life that fathers are exposed to, which now show up in their soon-to-be-born children, right? So it's the mixture of how these things are mixing that also causes a whole nother array. And at times, as was just being talked about, we don't know all of what the mixtures now will cause 15, 10, 20 years down the road. What we do know is what we have available, which is an immense amount of science that is showing us that we need to do much better, at least looking at these chemical by chemicals for who they are, and also considering how they mix together and what that means for us and our exposures.
Interesting. Justin, you want to weigh in on that a little bit?
Sure. So they did a really nice job of highlighting how sort of like occupational exposures and those communities that are situated around the areas where these plastics might be manufactured or broken down or recycled could be at increased exposures. And then we also know that there's a lot of consumer behaviors that can impact someone's exposure to these. We talked about sort of like the reusable water bottles and the takeout food containers. And so what we see when we think about like what are the ways that people are exposed in their homes, the major routes of exposure would be through your diet, right? Things that are contaminating the food, then you're eating that food, in the water you drink, or the air you breathe. Sometimes even kind of like what gets on our skin, some of these chemicals can sort of like diffuse through our skin.
Give us some examples of some of those chemicals that are plastic pollutant related that can diffuse through our skin.
So you can think about like, it's the holiday season, right? Everyone's buying toys for their kids and they're like all made of these like, some of these like very like flexible plastics. A lot of the chemicals that we were talking about, these phthalate type plastics, they're not bound to that material. They can sort of diffuse off the material. So as you encounter them with your hands, right, there's the opportunity for what we would call dermal transfer there. And then a lot of these chemicals, as they're in your house and they're sort of like leaving the products in your house, they'll accumulate very highly in dust. And so if you think about, a child's behavior, especially when they're really young, they're crawling around on your floor, right? They're encountering dust. They're doing a lot of like hand to mouth movements. They're like eating that dust. Turns out that that's a massive route of exposure that we didn't even anticipate before.
And let me ask you something else along that same line before we need to go to break. One of our guests, I think 2 shows ago, mentioned as well, she had been with the Plastics Pollution Coalition, and she was mentioning the sweater she had on that day that was made of polyester. And she mentioned that there were fibers there, and also she mentioned, I think maybe as she opened the Cheetos bag or something like that. Talk about that, because those are big common sources that people do not think of or do not know, because I just didn't know before then about the clothes in fast food bags.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. It's these really nice, these fibers and these products that have these like benefits that we use in consumer products that also have these adverse effects on the environment, right? So these like polyester clothing, these like the fleeces that are so comfortable, these microfiber cloths that are like amazing, you can just clean. They all have their own, they're like sort of like degrade into these sort of microplastics that are now contaminating the environment as well.
All around us. And NC, I saw that your hand was there, so we're going to go to break right now, but we'll get right back and start with you on the other side. Thank you, guys. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. We're back with part 2 of today's show on plastics pollution, the intersection with human cancers. I read a title from a scientific report I thought was so appropriate. It was Plastic Not So Fantastic: how the versatile material harms the environment and human health. So I love that. Plastic, not so fantastic. It rhymes a little bit, but again, very true. Of the most devastating elements of this pollution is that plastics take thousands of years to decay. As a result, fish and wildlife are becoming intoxicated, and consequently, the toxins from the plastics have entered the food chain, obviously threatening human health. The chemical building blocks that make plastic so versatile are the very same components that might harm people and the environment. However, greener solutions are becoming more available, and we'll talk about this much more with our guests later on. And again, back with us to help us to continue and explore the plastics assault on our health are Dr. Justin Colacino with the University of Michigan and Witherspoon with the Children's Environmental Health Network. Again, welcome back, and thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
And Insay, I want to start with you with something that you had said earlier. You made a point and gave us some statistics that 80% of the plastics or plastic ingredients are not tested. And so that tells me that 20% are. And from everything that we've been talking about on today's show, just about all of those 20% are hazardous to health. So that leads me to wonder, if we know that of the 20%, what's with this other 80%? Why aren't we testing? What might it take for us to become more concerned about that?
Bernice, thank you so much. You are pretty much calling the kettle what it is right now. We have a seriously broken toxic review, chemical review system in this country. In theory, it is supposed to work so that in a regular motion, on an annual basis, a certain number, like hundreds of known chemicals coming into our commerce before coming on in for use are supposed to be tested for their toxicity, for human health, safety, and all of that. And again, I will add, that is at an adult, usually healthy male level. That is not considering the vulnerability of a young child. That's all of us. Okay. So with that said, that is not happening. It has never happened. There are other parts of the world that do it much better and are seeing the returns on that, like the European REACH program, for example. We've been very behind, and hopefully with this new administration, a lot of us will be continuing to promote the fact that we have to do better. We have to be able to review these chemicals and not just assume. It's a backward system where right now we're assuming they're okay because in theory they're out in use and people are unknowingly, pulling them up, using them, using laundry detergent with some of this stuff in it, all of the above. And if you go and try to educate people on reading the labels, now there's an interesting situation where people are being sent to websites. So most of us, including me, mother of four, don't have the time while you're shopping right now in the present to go to a website and try to figure it all out. And then sometimes you go to these websites, the information is far from transparent. So that's where some groups like ours and many others try to come in and try to be a caveat. But at the end of the day, we need a system that is functional, that is easy for all of us in the public to understand so that we know exactly where our hard-earned money is going and where we choose for it to go. So we're very much behind the ball here. And in order to even catch up to where we are going into a new year, we have to really ramp up in a serious way and make this a priority.
Indeed. One of the things I'm always espousing on this show, and I'm going to continue to espouse it, is the art of labeling. Like we have the labels on the food regarding all the calories and the various ingredients, and that is that we begin to label some of our plastic products. But it looks like we might need to label food also as it relates to plastic content and possibilities. But I'll leave that to the next show when I will espouse it again. Having you two experts, though, I want to move on and talk a little bit more about the types of cancers, or what are the most prevalent types of cancers that we see, that we know, or that we suspect are being influenced by plastic pollution. Justin, we'll start with you on that.
Sure. So a lot of the data that we've seen with respect to plastics causing cancer, where we can really link them to cancer in humans, derives from these very high-level occupational studies like we're describing, where we know that those plastic manufacturers are at increased risk of things like liver cancer and lung cancer. What we're learning now from these lower-level exposures that most of us may be encountering on a daily basis, these plastics that kind of look like hormones to our bodies. We were talking about bisphenol A or BPA. There's a whole suite of other bisphenols, S and F and AF and Z, that also, they all look like hormones. So my lab studies breast cancer. It seems like a lot of these chemicals might promote breast cancer because these chemicals look like estrogen, and breast cancers often need estrogen to grow. Similarly, we see relationships with things like phthalate exposure and testicular cancer. Ense was talking about how young baby boys are particularly susceptible to the effects of phthalates. It's because they're having like testicular alterations during development, which may lead to things like cancer. So oftentimes a lot of these are reproductive organs that might be particularly susceptible to the effects of these plastic compounds that look like hormones to our body.
Our guest on last week's show, Dr. Shanna Swan with the Icon School, reviewed with us a book that she had just written called Countdown, and it very specifically related some research that showed how plastics affected the development of male sex organs. So that's hard hitting. So I want to ask you though, you said that the body mistakes some of these plastic components to hormones. And I've continually heard the phrase that plastics are hormone disruption. So I want to talk about that a little bit more. And we want to jump to Ense. And if you can talk to us a little bit about that, connect the dots for us, and talk about the spectrum of exposure. Does exposure to that affect everybody the same way?
No, it's a good point. I mean, all of these exposures do actually impact, there's a lot of variance here. So it's very common where there will be some treatment happening where there's some exposure in a large family, and maybe it's one child out of all of them. So you're trying to figure out what are the patterns of that child that made that child more susceptible. Maybe it's some other place that child is going and spending time, or where they happen to go to school where the other ones don't. There could be a lot of things. It doesn't always mean that the exposure is going to always be equal and the same. And it also depends on your immune system and what's also happening. So these endocrine disruptors, right? These are these hormone, disruptors as well. They interfere with the body's hormone and also the endocrine system. So the chemicals definitely that are linked with developmental, reproductive, brain, immune, and other problems. So,
and I want to jump in one moment and interrupt you, because I want listeners to know that hormones and endocrines, and you guys both tell me right, these are the body's regulators. So when you've got something that's disrupting the factors and the chemicals and the components that regulate the body, then you've got something there.
That's right, and especially when those regulators, thank you, are also having direct impact with major organs of the body. I will also mention that we were part of, through the Cancer-Free Economy Network, which I'm happy to explain more about in a minute, we released with a lot of partners this fall in September, the first childhood cancer prevention report, which identifies gaps in the science, but also some definite linkages in the trends. So we're seeing pesticide exposures for young children, high risk. We're seeing vehicle emissions, air pollutants, and we're seeing paints and solvents really showing up in a very serious way when it comes to trends of rare forms of childhood cancers.
And we've got just a couple of minutes before we go to break. So I want to get Justin to weigh in here, because I remember that some of his research was to characterize environmental susceptibility while explaining the causes of sporadic cancer, but understanding the changes that occur at the non-genetic level. Because it struck me what you just said, so much of this in the past, there's been an attempt to explain it away by lifestyles, but we see perfectly healthy people who are doing all the right things and they still get stricken. So Justin, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and so we really used to think that cancer was a genetic disease, right? You inherit like a set of genetic differences from your parents, and that explains your whole risk of cancer, but that's not how it turns out. It looks like, at least for the cancers that we study, some of these cancers that you get later in life, like breast cancer or colon cancer, maybe somewhere between 70 to 90% of these cancers are actually explained by the environment. And what makes us concerned with respect to these plastics exposures, especially these plastic exposures that can act like hormones, is what is happening during early life development, especially when a baby is in mom and might be exposed to these chemicals. Could that set them on a trajectory that makes them more likely to develop cancer later in life? And so there's a lot of data in both animal studies and now emerging in human studies that suggest that these exposures in utero might be the ones that really predispose someone to developing diseases like breast cancer later in life.
That early, huh? And I remember a phrase that I've written down that I'm going to use often now that Ense used, and that was pre-polluting our children. And so what you said is we are pre-polluting our children even at the level of planting in their breast cancer risk in vitro. That is absolutely amazing. We are going to go to break, after which we will continue this very, very interesting conversation. We'll be back on the other side with Insay Witherspoon and Justin Colacino after the break. Thank you. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, promoting environmental awareness through expo, conferences, film festival, interactive experiences, and now EarthX TV. Our other sponsors, Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority, or the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods grocers, natural grocers, Central Market, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available online free for download at nadallas.com. Check them out. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, and more, and we're told with the best Christmas trees in Texas. Our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. And we are back with some amazing experts helping us to explore and understand this topic of plastic pollution and the intersection with human cancers. Just before the break, I believe Justin was telling us, he mentioned breast cancer, which is something that's affected most people, either personally or a relative or a friend or coworker or someone they know. And it was very interesting, and I want to dive deeper on the fact that he said that we can even be programming our children for breast cancer risk in vitro. And I want to take this back to dive deeper to you, Insay, because that is your specialty and your area of expertise with the Children's Environmental Health Network. And you, again, use that phrase that we are pre-polluting our children. So talk to us more about this and how it can happen that in vitro we are preparing people for breast cancer.
Yeah, it's pretty deep, and most people do not eat. I mean, it's very shocking.
Yes, it
digest that. And, a lot of us ideally, actually, our organization started out in the late 80s in California training healthcare professionals because they were misdiagnosing what we now know to be the youngest of our children, exposed to what we now know to be these range of chemicals. Sadly, all the way through to almost 30 years later, yes, we have some of our frontline workers, nurses in particular, and MDs that get this, but it still is not standardized in any way. In our ideal situation, every OBGYN, every pediatrician, every family doctor would be thinking about these type of things, talking about these type of things, asking some key questions. We call it environmental history well before any type of concern is identified, and especially when women of childbearing age are considering, having children. A good amount of these issues, these lifelong or these even short-term with lifelong implication type of health concerns can be prevented by education, by removing some of these elements in our environment in the first place, and not putting the onus on consumers like all of us to have to make these tough decisions of what's the safest. It should just be natural. It should just be a part of anything that's on the shelf. We should be able to have accountability and trust that it has been tested accordingly so we can move our attention to other important matters in our lives.
And you just so well stated what is the Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio goal. We're trying to play our little part in helping just ordinary, everyday folks to explore and understand and to get the word out, to get this important information out that experts like you and Justin generate and things that you all know and work with every day. So, again, thank you for being with us on that level. Let me ask you this, too, though, Insay. We've consistently been told that some plastics can last way past our lifetime, that there's a long life cycle, and some of them we don't know when they're going to disintegrate because they've been around so long, or we won't be around that long. Does that long life cycle impact how they interact or intersect with the body and when they interact or intersect with the body?
There are these windows of very prime exposure, so prenatal for sure. And even when that child is born, it's amazing to think our human brain is still developing into our toddler years. You know, our respiratory system is still developing, our musculoskeletal system. So all of that also places young children at extreme harm risk. And again, young children can't control where they're going and what they're exposed to, right? They kind of have to go with who's caregiving for them. So there are things that are totally unbeknownst to young children that they're exposed to, eating and drinking and all that places them at harm's risk and can get into the disruption that we talked about earlier of those natural systems in their development. Everything from asthma, if it's air pollution, you know, we now see onset of asthma, you know, not just a severity of asthma because of just simple exposure to known air pollutants. But toddler years, young life through toddler years are extremely high risk. It doesn't mean we're out of the gate as we get into school age years, just not as risky, and then as we get older and older.
Let me go to you, Justin, for a moment, because you, again, have put all of our antenna up with regards to breast cancer. Can you tell us about what may be perhaps the most important or perhaps the most significant and promising plastics and cancer research that might be going on right now, or any findings?
Yeah, so I think what we really are missing and what a lot of folks are starting to move towards is developing new ways to evaluate these plastics, where we talked about there's thousands and thousands and thousands of different chemicals that are in use where we don't really know their health effects yet. And so toxicologists are making a move from studying one chemical at a time to being able to study hundreds or thousands of chemicals now with these like really neat computational methods or these really cool cell culture-based methods. So I think this is really promising for us to develop new ways to identify which chemicals might be the most toxic, make sure that those are the ones that we don't use in our products, and then let us prioritize chemicals which may have lower toxicity but the same sort of like functional efficacy when we use them in a product in order to make products safer for people. I think there's a lot of promise here, and it's really exciting to see the field develop.
And I know, Insay, that you do a lot of policy work, and Justin was just telling us about some promising things that are on the horizon. Can you talk to us for just a minute? What is happening on the policy level? There looks to be a lot of really good research going on, a lot of good findings, that it's almost like climate change, where it's getting hard to deny that the effects of plastic pollution on our health are detrimental and far-reaching. Where are we with that on the policy level, Insay?
Sure. So we are an active leader with the Cancer-Free Economy Network, and this is this robust effort, a multidiscipline, lots of folks involved, that is within one generation. We want to change the paradigm of how we think about and consider cancer in the United States. Cancer is traditionally treatment-oriented right now. It very much, per our conversation, needs to also be balanced, not to take away from treatment, to include where we need and can move on prevention. So with that, we have a policy legal side of this. We have a market shift side of this, because the reality is our economy is based on the dependency of these chemicals that we're talking about. So it's not just going to be a light switch that we just turn on and just say, okay, we're not going to produce this stuff anymore. We have to think about the livelihoods that are involved. How are we creating a just transition so that those that are in these industries have another way to put food on the table and have a living and also feel good about what they're doing? If these industries get phased out, as we are trying collectively to do across the country, we need to have a chemical review process that is actually functioning, like we were talking about earlier. And that's where EPA comes in and other federal agencies to do this job of being our protectors, if you will, our public health guidance and protectors. We need to have more funding and capacity for cancer prevention. If you go to the National Cancer Institute, you know, there's a lot of money there, and it's predominantly heavily spent on treatment. We need to, again, adjust that percentage as well. And then there are a variety of standards and policies that are happening, best practices that are being lifted up by non-governmental groups and other advocate groups across the country. There are some best practices that we are trying to lift up as national entities and show others across the country what is working to reduce some of these known exposures, while the policies and standards that need to be in place are coming. That takes time. So how do we protect people now? How do we inform them, educate them, and then added provisions and protections for them?
And really quickly, what are some of those best practices? Just if you can tell us just some quickly.
Well, first of all, these industry polluters need to be held accountable. They need to be called out. They need to be proving that the manufacturing process that they are overseeing is truly not causing harm, as many of the community members say they are, like in places like Cancer Alley and Mossville, Alabama, and on and on. These justice issues are very obvious. So the policy leaders need to get in line and stop being in line with these industries and look at the public health well-being, and they need to be on the side of science and protection and public health for starters.
And you mentioned cancer prevention, which I think is key. It reminds me of how smoking got to be a cancer prevention issue and a number of others. And it seems like we need to add that if we could have similar campaigns for plastics that could be effective as well. Justin, back to you, though. How do you think it's best to reduce our exposure and protect our health as it relates to plastic pollution?
I mean, certainly we know our best way to reduce exposure to chemicals is through policy regulations, right? Where the government takes action and actually gets those chemicals out of the environment. That's the best way to do it. Unfortunately, now we're in the scenario where individuals have to take action. But in our own lives, right, we can limit our use of single-use plastics. We can make sure that we're, limiting the use of PVC-based products in our homes. We can make sure that we're, keeping our homes clean and free of dust so that we're not getting exposed, at least in our houses, where we can control our own exposure. But additionally, we want to put pressure on our legislation to make changes in this area. That's where the big impacts can be.
It seems like a lot of this too could help from communication. And that takes me back to a phrase that INSEE used, and that was just transition. Perhaps if we can get a communications campaign to make the manufacturers of plastic, as well as the workers who benefit there, make them realize perhaps that they are not in the plastic manufacturing industry, but rather the packaging industry. And that then would open up their minds to look for and to receive more healthy alternatives, rather than the stuff that they are producing now that assaults us. I really want to thank both of you all for being with us. We fully look forward to having both of you back on our future shows, because we realize we have just cracked the surface on this. We have been with Dr. Justin Colacino with the University of Michigan, and we have been with INSEE Witherspoon with the Children's Environmental Health Network. And we thank you all both for sharing your expertise with us today. You have made us smarter. And thank you, listeners, for listening in today. The conversation starts here, but our goal is for it to continue in your home, in your social circles, your workplaces, at the water cooler, and in the grocery checkout line, so that we can all work together to realize that healthy living is simply not possible without a healthy planet. Our culture is a result of 1 trillion tiny acts taken by billions of people every day like yourself. And each of these tiny acts can seem insignificant, but all of them add up, one way or the other, to the change we each live through. This is your host, Bernice Butler. Thank you, and join us again next week for more Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio.